For more than 200 years, the Afaris and the Fells have been in serious conflict. They have never gone to full-scale war, but there have been moments where the tension was so high it felt inevitable. Afari's once lush green landscape saw the rise of many druidic circles throughout their evolution. The Afari people as a whole had a great reverence for the land and for nature. Afari culture was more interested in living peacefully amongst the gifts that Etania had provided for them. They were not a people that focused on plundering resources for wealth and advancing an economy. The people of Emberfell, or Fells as they're called, lived in a land with varied resources and a landscape that provided for them in a more diverse way. Early on in Fell evolution, the people developed tools to work the land and tunnel beneath the mountains. This led to the evolution of fine craft and the making of beautiful things. The Fells became a nation where mankind's pursuit of advancement was at the center of their culture. The conflict's origins begin when Afari suffered an environmental shift that was too sudden to be natural. Afari's landscape essentially died over a 20 to 30 year period without explanation. The Afari people began to suffer from the lack of food and the arid conditions. The governments of Emberfell stepped in to help and offered support in the form of humanitarian aid. The Fells now regularly send massive shipments of food to the Afari continent. The Afaris were determined to understand this ecological shift in their lands. Many of their explanations for this disaster arose from the myths and legends of their deeply held belief systems. The Afaris were not a people to research the physical biology of their lands. Instead, their focus shifted to a charismatic leader that had left their continent and emigrated to Emberfell around the same time the dying of the lands began. His name was Kalagenia, and the Afaris wanted him extradited back to pay for the crimes they suspected him of. There was anecdotal evidence that Kalagenia had stolen a sacred core from under the ground called the Heart of the Vasserine and took it to Emberfell. Now, as the crisis in Afari came to a head and the lands had all but died off, the Afari government made a plea to the Fells to return Kalagenia and the Heart by force so that they could regenerate their landscape. The Fells listened to the case and deliberated the situation. Ultimately, the request to extradite Kalagenia was denied on several fronts. Firstly, the Fells were reluctant to make such a dramatic move on the notion of a myth. There was no evidence that such a heart existed, not to mention that it was the cause for all Afari problems. Second, recent changes in the Fell political influence lobbied hard in favor of aid and provisions to Afari over the extradition of a respected Fell citizen. This move has always been seen as suspicious and having some dark agenda, but it was passed nonetheless. Now, since then, 170 years have passed. The Afaris resent the Fells' position and see them as a greedy, commerce-driven culture that prioritizes wealth over true justice. There have been hundreds of terroristic attacks, mostly minor, on the Fells that the Afaris have taken credit for. The Fells sometimes respond to these attacks depending on the severity with force or sanctions, and the slightest interruption of supplies to Afari is felt on a large scale. The Afaris resent having to depend so heavily on another nation for their survival. As a result of all of this, the border between the two continents at the Bond of Gravenwich has been tightened up immensely. This has led to private smuggling operations across the Pelshaw Abyss and dozens of other covert organizations focused on thwarting the boundaries' restrictions. In Emberfell, Druids are abundant and mostly seen as peaceful. They're accepted people. There are, however, a growing number of citizens that connect them to the increasing terrorism that has plagued their lands. But Druids are more and more seen as a threat to the Fells' way of life, and tensions within their own boundaries are growing. In Afari, Fell folk are quickly recognizable and not welcome. The Afari continent is a dangerous place for outsiders, and travel there is deemed dangerous for those of Emberfell. These two continents are on the verge of war at any given moment. The Afaris, without an organized military, resort to more covert attacks, while the Fells insist on keeping the peace and the status quo. So there you have it. That's the Emberfell-Afari conflict in a nutshell. And as we get more information on that, we'll update this. Take care.